Bing Crosby's got nothing on you. Thank you very, very much. Thank you, Aaron. Well, good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to the Alaska Center for Spiritual Living, and thank you all for coming out on this chilly day. It's 2 at my house this morning. So thank you for coming out, and for those of you that did not brave the 2 degrees, you're home in your pajamas watching on YouTube, you're welcome as well. You're just missing out on all the wonderful goings on here, and the decorations and everything that's here, and the hugs and the love. Oh, we still love you anyway, but you're not here to receive the hug. All this month we have been looking at this Christmas. We've been looking at the birth of Jesus of Nazareth and what that has had to do and what some of the meaning behind all of it is. And today we're going to drive that down a little bit further. One of the things that I want to talk about today is that this time of year gives us the opportunity to see the good in everyone, regardless of your faith tradition or religion or anything else. This time of year gives us that opportunity to see the good in everyone. On December 24th, 1914, World War I had been going for about 5 months, and on what was known then as the Western Front. It was somewhere partway through northern and eastern France. Along the battle lines, there was a no man's land in the middle, and the Germans were on one side, and the French and the English were on the other side. And on December 24th, things got quiet in the evening. It was dark, and the roar of the battle and the guns and the artillery died for a little while. And a voice came up on the German side, and it was singing O Tannenbaum. The words were not familiar to the soldiers on the other side, but the music was undeniably familiar. O Christmas Tree. And from the German side, on their side of the trenches, came up Christmas trees. And the battlefield was silent. And for a while, everything just remained silent. And then from the German side, out walked one man. And he just walked out, risking, of course, being shot. But he just walked out. And he said, "You no shoot, we no shoot." And then he said, "Frohe Weihnachten." And the French on their side all said, "Joyeux Noël." And the British said, "Merry Christmas." And then men stood up from the French and the British side and walked to the middle. And the Germans, and they all met in no man's land. They stepped over rotting corpses to get there. And they shook hands. They traded pictures of loved ones. They shared their meager rations. An unfortunate wild pig somehow got into no man's land and was soon turned on a spit, which many soldiers enjoyed. I think I read somewhere where American cigarettes were a great item to trade and to give away in that moment. And then somehow someone produced a soccer ball, and a rousing game of football broke out. Both sides claiming to have won 3-2. But at the end, they all shook hands, and no one really cared what the score was. Continued on through the night and through the next day, the camaraderie, the peace. The story that most of us understand today, or we have been told that we'd find in history books and news, is then it was on the following day fighting resumed. But that really wasn't the case. Fighting didn't fully resume until almost March. The soldiers had made agreements. If we're forced to fire at you by our superiors, we're going to aim high. And finally, the truce was broken in March, and full battle regained. And finally, when the truce was signed in 1918, 16 million men had died. But the significance of that night, of that Christmas Eve, is it shows us that we can have this. We can live a life that's different. And Claire, thank you so much. What a beautiful thing, because we don't have to take what somebody else tells us. We don't have to listen to a Syrian general that tells us we have to worship something different. There is a quote in the Christian Bible. It's from Paul's letter to the Romans. One of my pet peeves, I think you know this, is just grabbing quotes out of the Bible and reciting this as this is the absolute truth and there's no exception to it in any way, shape, or form. And I think that it's important for us to take any quote that we have in the Bible and look at it and put it in its context and what is it saying. Then this is a good example of that. This was in the letter to the Romans, Paul's letter to the Romans. What was Paul doing? Paul wasn't out necessarily preaching the gospel of Jesus. He left that to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John. What Paul was doing was how to build a church. And he was out addressing the Romans. He was addressing the Gentiles. Now, I can do a whole sermon on that. It all gets down into circumcision, and that's why they didn't have a lot of Gentile volunteers among the men in those days. But what he said is, do not imitate the ways of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds. That's exactly what the Hebrews did. They didn't conform to what the Syrians told them they had to do. They were transformed by the renewing of their own minds. The giving of gifts is common to this time of year, and it's common in many, many different traditions. We're, of course, most familiar with the Christmas tradition, Santa Claus, and everything else, but it extends through Judaism and the Hebrews and Hanukkah and exchanging of gifts every night. It's a wonderful tradition. One year, I don't know if you remember, I did my entire Christmas sermon was, yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus. A little girl had written into the New York Sun, the editor, and asked, is there a Santa Claus? And his answer was beautiful. And this next story is a lot like that. It's a story of a little boy whose sister, mean sister, he was just 7, and she came up and told him, there is no such thing as Santa Claus. That's Mom and Dad. Only a real fool would believe that there's such a thing as Santa Claus. He was heartbroken by this, so there was one place that he knew he could get the truth, and that was Grandma. And she also had some of the greatest cinnamon buns in the world. So he knew that he could get the straight dope from Grandma. So he got on his bike and he rode across town to Grandma's. And he went and he asked Grandma. He said, my sister just told me that there's no such thing as Santa Claus. Is that true? I need to know what's true. And Grandma said, no such thing as Santa Claus? Why, that's ridiculous. You know, she said, I've been hearing that rumor around here for some years now, and it just plain makes me mad. Let's get in a car. We're going. Where are we going? You'll see. So grab your coat and get in the car. They got in their car and they drove down to Kirby's General Store, which is the nearest little general store that they had. And Kirby's had a little bit of everything in it. And it's late. It's not, too many days before Christmas, and it was crowded with people doing their last minute shopping and everything. And Grandma walked him up to the door. Then as they got there, she reached into her wallet and she took out a $10 bill, and she gave a little boy a $10 bill. And she said, now I want you to go in there and buy something for somebody. Buy them something that they need. Buy something for somebody that they need. Well, he's only 7. He'd never been shopping by himself before. He'd never bought anything all by himself. All he knew was that $10 was a lot of money, and he could buy just about anything with $10. So he thought about, what could I possibly do? And he thought of his, family, his mom and his sister, no. And he thought of what he could possibly do and get. And then he thought about a boy in his school, little Bobby Decker. And Bobby Decker had messy hair and dirty clothes and bad breath, and he sat behind him in his little second grade class, and he knew Bobby Decker didn't have a coat. His mom wrote a note saying Bobby has a cough, and so he can't go out to recess today. But the little boy knew that Bobby didn't have a cough, and he didn't have a coat either. And so he went over and he looked, and there was a whole bunch of coats that would be about the right size and whatnot, and he looked through them, and he found a coat that would be perfect. It was corduroy, and it was heavy. It'd be enough to keep him warm. It was lined on the inside. He knew Bobby would like that, and it had a hood, so he thought that'd really be good. And so he took that coat and he went up to the counter and he laid it down along with the $10 bill. And the lady that checked him out looked down. She looked at the $10 bill. She looked at the coat and she said, "Is this a Christmas present for someone?" And he said, "Yes." She says, "Who's it for?" He says, "It's for Bobby. He's in my class and he doesn't have a coat." Well, the little boy never did figure out what the cost of that coat was, but he didn't get any change back. But he got his coat and he took it out. And so he and Grandma went home and they wrapped it in a festive Christmas wrapping, and she had him write on a note, "To Bobby from Santa Claus." She said, "Santa insists on secrecy." So he wrote that on there, and she says, "Okay, we're getting back in the car." They got in the car, and she said, "Okay, from this moment on, you are now officially and forever one of Santa's helpers." And they drove over to Bobby's house. And it was getting dark by then. And so they parked a couple of blocks away, and they walked along and crept along over until they were close, and they hid in the bushes in front of Bobby's house. And she looked down and she says, "Okay, Santa, get to work." And so he ran up and he put the package down on Bobby's doorstep, hit the doorbell, and he waited a second, he hit it a second time, and then he ran as fast as he could, and he jumped into the bushes next to Grandma. And sure enough, the door opened a minute later, and there was Bobby. And he looked around, and then he looked down, and there was the package, and he picked it up and he went in. When this story was told, it wrote, "It's been 65 years, but that memory of hiding in those bushes next to Grandma and shivering will never leave me. For I absolutely know that there is a Santa Claus, because I'm on his team." My last point is, who we are and what we do makes a difference in the world. There's a lady by the name of Jean, and she sat at her desk at home. She had a mountain of Christmas cards to write, and she just couldn't. For the last several years, she'd been writing from Jean and Don. And Jean and Don had gone through a very painful divorce that year. And it just didn't seem right to just have her name alone. And she didn't feel like putting up Christmas decorations and a tree and everything else, because Christmas is supposed to be for family. Christmas is supposed to be for sharing with the people that you love. And she just didn't feel like it, and she put her pen down in disgust, and she made up her mind right then. There's going to be no tree, there's going to be no decorations, and there's going to be no Christmas cards either. Once you heard the doorbell, ding dong, oh, who can that be here now? Ding dong. So she padded to the door in her fluffy socks and opened the door, and there wasn't anybody there. She looked out, and there on the porch rail was a green gift bag. What is this? So she picked it up. She took it back into the house. She sat on her table and put her hand in, and there was shredded tinsel and other stuff, and she dug through that and got down, and there was an envelope in it. She said, what is this, a letter? And she opened it up, and she opened the envelope. It wasn't a letter, it was a story. And she started to read. We have another little boy, probably about the same age, probably about 7. He had just been admitted to an orphanage in Denmark. And he was really afraid, but the other orphans were really nice to him, and they helped him out, and they encouraged him, and the other orphans told him, boy, you got a good time to come here. He said, why is that? And he says, because pretty soon it's going to be Christmas. And Christmas is the absolute best. Well, why is it the best? Oh, for one thing, they come down and they cut down a tree, a Christmas tree, and they bring it into the dining hall. And they decorate it with all of these candles. There's candles all over the dining hall. It is so bright in there. It is beautiful. And the aroma you can smell, the pine tree, it's just beautiful. You will love at Christmas when we bring the tree in. But that's not all. What else? Because also at Christmas, instead of getting our usual gruel, the thin, watery gruel, we get stew. It's got meat in it, and potatoes, and vegetables, and it's delicious. And we get to eat all we want. Wow, he says, that must be great, but that's not all. What could possibly be more? Because after we eat, the headmaster calls us up one at a time, and we each get our own orange. Now, he had heard of oranges. He even touched one once. And he swore that he could still smell the orange on his fingers for days afterward. But he could, that rough texture and everything. And how wonderful it must be. Juicy and sweet. How wonderful it would be to get your very own orange. So he was excited. He was really excited about how wonderful it would be to get his very own orange. And then the story stopped. And she looked over, turned over the next page, and this is what it said. Everyone needs to celebrate Christmas. Wouldn't you agree? Watch for part 2. So she didn't know what to do, but She did feel a little better anyway, and she thought of that poor boy at the orphanage and how wonderful it would be for him to have at least one night of fun. And so she went to bed that night and got up the next day, and it was filled with the going to work and the hustle and all of the stuff that we do at this time of year, and people coming and going and rushing and on and on. And she got home and she had pretty much forgotten about all of it and was immersed in her own problems and feeling lonely and rejected and all of the other things that she had felt going through the divorce. And then ding dong, and then she remembered. This time she rushed to the door and opened it up, and this time sitting out on the porch rail was a red gift bag. And so she couldn't wait to grab the red gift bag and tore it open, and sure enough, inside was another envelope. And she opened the envelope and she read. And it was amazing because the story continued, and everything that the little boy had been promised was true. Christmas Eve came and it was magical. It was just absolutely amazing. The dining room was filled with the most glorious odors and scents and aroma of this lamb stew, and the fresh cut Christmas tree, and the candles was so bright, it was so beautiful. He was just amazed, and he was filled with the joy of Christmas. And then, just as he'd heard, the boys were called up, and each one was given an orange. And they all went up. But he was never there. He was never called. So he finally just walked up by himself. And the headmaster said, "I'm sorry, son." He said, "but you got here too late for the count, and there is no orange for you. But next year, you will for sure get an orange." And he was crushed. He had so looked forward to getting an orange, and he didn't know why, but he just turned and ran. And he ran back upstairs. He ran to his little bunk bed, and he threw his face into his pillow, and he just sobbed. And he sobbed, and he sobbed, and sobbed. And then he felt a hand on his back. I thought, what? What could that be? And that was the end of that story.
Really? Bummer. Yeah.
Jean's day flew by the next day. She couldn't wait to get home. When she got home, she hadn't been home long, and there was the ding dong. She rushed to the door and threw it open, and there on the porch rail was a gold bag. She couldn't wait to get it. She picked it up. It was much heavier than the other two had been, but she couldn't wait to get the envelope. She got in, she tore it open, she opened the envelope and looked at it, and inside the envelope was the rest of the story. So as the little boy laid there and he felt that hand on his back, he smelled it before he saw it. Then he turned around, and there on his pillowcase inside of a cloth napkin were little slices of oranges, all enough to make a complete orange for him. What the other orphans had done is they had peeled their oranges, and each one gave him one segment enough to give him a complete orange. Who we are and what we do make a difference in the world. And in that moment, Jean realized that she was focused on her own self and her own problems and what she had. She reached into the rest of the box, and there was an orange, but it was a chocolate orange. It was already in segments. And she began to think about it, and she thought about her neighbor, Mrs. Wilson, just 2 doors down, that tomorrow was headed in for her 3rd round of chemo and radiation. And then she thought of her running partner, Jen, who was a single mom trying to make it on her own with a difficult teenager. And then she thought of poor Mr. Robinson just across the street, who was slowly going blind and losing his independence. She thought about the people in her life and the things that made a difference. And she realized that if we all come together with our slice, our segment of the orange that we have in our lives, and we can support someone else, we can make each other whole. And so my Christmas message for you is to share your slice, to give a slice of your life to someone else. And so it is with that awareness of our own importance. It's an awareness of our own ability to have a truce in our life, even at the most difficult of times. I invite my colleagues, the practitioners, to join me in holding our congregation in that very love, the love of life, the love of God. And to simply recognize that this thing that we go through that we call life can be filled with struggles, it can be filled with things that are hard, but beneath all of that there is a love, there is a peace that is true at this time of year and true every moment of every year, but at this time of year of the shortest days, the veil is thin and we are so much closer. And we have had examples of what we can do when we can step forth and we can call our own truce in our own lives. We can step into that place where we can see the good in everyone and in everything. We can step into that place where lack and limitation and separation from each other and separation from God can fall away, and we can come to the place where we are the slice of life that we give to one another. And so we just give thanks. We give thanks for our awareness of the power and the presence of that infinite creative power of the universe that is in, through, and as each and every one of us. We give thanks. And we can just step into this Christmas season, this Christmas night, this Christmas day, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, whatever the tradition, and be grateful for our awareness of the presence of God. And so it is.
And so it is.